July 11, 1943. At 900 hours, General Gay, Captain Stiller, and I, accompanied by a number of soldiers, departed from the Monrovia in the Admiral's Barquet, and at 930 reached the shore in the near jailer. Standing on the shore, I noticed 2 anti-personnel mines that had been put out of action, and 7 other stranded light landing craft. While I was surveying the enemy opened fire with guns. I cannot say exactly from what guns, but it seems to be from 88. I can't say exactly what kind, but it appears to be 88 or 105mm guns. The shells came within about 30 meters from the shore, but they couldn't hit it. The city fortifications were in the way. After lowering the reconnaissance vehicle to the shore, I was going to go to the headquarters of the 1st Division, located 5 kilometers to the south, east along the road that stretched along the shore. On the left as we entered Jailu, we saw the banner of the Rangers and decided to drop in on their commander, Lieutenant Colonel O. Darby. This idea proved to be extremely fortunate and one might say life-saving, for if we had thought we would have come face to face with 7 German tanks advancing on the road to the town as soon as we arrived at Lieutenant Colonel Darby's command post. The town was attacked from the northeast by a fairly large force of Italians and Germans. Darby had at his disposal a battery of enemy guns, a company of the 3rd Battalion of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 2 battalions of paratroopers, a company of chemical mortars, and a battalion of the 39th Engineer. On the right flank, Darby was cut off from the 1st Division by those approaching from the right toward the town at a distance of 900 meters from the tanks. We went to an observation post located at a distance of 100 meters from the front line. From there we could see the enemy moving across the field 700 to 800 meters from us. To block the road, Darby sent 3 half-tracked vehicles, not designed not for combat, but for the transportation of tools and other engineer equipment. Nevertheless, the all-terrain vehicles interfered with the advance of the Italians, who, as we realized, had no mobile artillery. By 50 p.m., the Italian advance seemed to be running out of steam, and we went to Darby's headquarters to see what was being done on the right flank. What was happening on the right flank, which we could see from Jailer. After a while, 2 light bombers dropped bombs on the town, and then the Germans opened fire with 88mm guns. Twice they hit the house where we were stationed in, and also left a hole in the roof of the building opposite. But none of us were hurt, just the civilians. I've never heard such screaming in my life, screaming so loud it drowned out the sounds of battle. Meanwhile, an officer of the 3rd Division brought 10 tanks to our aid, having made a short march from Likativ Jalu. Also pulled up were 2 tanks from the Assault B Brigade. I told Gaffey to close the hole between Dietschiller and the 1st Division positions, and to send a company of tanks to help Darby, which was done. Having received reinforcements, Darby immediately attacked the enemy on his left and, dispersing him, captured 500 prisoners. By the forces of our other units were destroyed the same 7 tanks that threatened the positions east of Jailer. A little later, an officer arrived with a report on the situation in the 3rd Division. Then General Roosevelt arrived, and we discussed with him the miscalculations of the 1st Division that prevented it from advancing last night. The main reason, it seemed to me, was that the division had moved forward without having the anti-tank guns, and also without adequate artillery preparation. I nevertheless counterattacked by German tanks. The division's personnel showed themselves at the best side, destroying a considerable number of enemy armored vehicles. On our account today, as I think, we can write down 14 sunk tanks of the enemy. I myself personally saw 11. Later I thought that I should meet with Generals Allen and Gaffey. When we were on our way to see them, we met Allen on the way, and after stopping, at about 3:30 p.m. we went up the hill. Just at that time, a group of 14 German bombers, which were met by the friendly fire of our anti-aircraft gunners. And although we got out of the way, we still remained in the line of attack of the German planes so that anti-aircraft shells were flying over our heads. One such piece fell on the ground only 5 or maybe 7 meters away from General Gay and me. As a result, 2 bombers and 1 fighter escort were shot down, and 1 fighter escort. We then got into our cars and went to the headquarters of the 2nd Armoured Division. While we were there, the Germans tried to get us with gunfire. However, they didn't shoot very well. Probably the mountain prevented them from aiming, so all their shells flew over the milk. It was decided that in the morning Allen and Gaffey would take the airfield at Ponte Olivo. After the meeting we drove back to Gela and got there without incident. Still, I think it was a strange trip at least. Unusual. It's rare for an army commander and his chief of staff to ride unprotected along the front line at the same distance from enemy troops. But those 10 kilometers, as I said, we passed safely. As we drove back to Jelu, we could see the sea in the distance, over which rose a plume of black smoke from the bombing. The black smoke from the German-bombed Liberty. The fatal hit had happened right before our eyes. The explosion had been such that the wreckage had flown to a height of at least 1/4 of a kilometer, fire erupted, thunder rumbled, and the ship broke into 2 halves. Now, nearly 6 hours later, as I write these lines, the stern is still afloat, most, if not all. The 115 men on board were unhurt. They were safely evacuated from the blown-up ship, while we waited on shore near Jela for the Monrovia to come ashore to board her again. To go aboard her again, I watched a few of our boys engaged in a rather silly business. They were fox hunting, which in itself might be a good thing to do, but not when they're doing it around 500-pound bombs, and 7 tons of high-explosive artillery shells. Of high explosive power. "Fellows," I said to them, "if you want the army to save the expense of your funeral, then go on like this. If you want to live to see dig your trenches somewhere else." Just at that moment, 2 enemy planes arrived and blasted the shore with bombs and shells. Our guys jumped into their trenches. I walked back and forth. Here, and when the planes flew away and the soldiers came out of hiding, I shamed them for their cowardice. We returned to Monrovia only at 19:0, soaked to the skin. Today is the first day of the campaign, and I believe I have justified the people's trust. July 18, 1943. After a successful start of the offensive and the first victories gained ashore on the 10th, we have continued to advance ahead of the plan, ahead of schedule. It happened so because, having forced the enemy to retreat, we could not stop and chase the enemy, stepping on his toes. And the escape of the enemy was so hasty for the reason that the Italians and the Germans had spent a great deal of energy, money, and a lot of time to establish defences. It seems that the same thing happened here as in the case of Troy and the walls that the Romans built in Europe. The higher the walls went up, the more impregnable the towers became. The weaker the morale of the defenders, unable to rely on their own strength in open battle. If they had spent even 1/3 of their construction effort to fight us, we could hardly have gotten the island to take over the situation on the island so quickly. Although, on the other hand, we cannot but admit that the Italians, the majority of them the Italians, mostly northerners, fought desperately. The Germans, compared to the units we fought in Tunisia, they were weaker. Not that they lacked courage. No, I wouldn't say that, but they lacked judgment, especially the commanders. Of the tank units, the number of captured soldiers and officers, captured guns and other equipment shows more eloquently than any words how successful our actions were. I don't want to make comparisons, but I believe that during all this time, the 8th Army captured hardly more than 5,000 enemy soldiers. The enemy mines the bodies of their dead, shoots us in the back, and uses dum. As a result of such actions, we have an increasing number of dead and wounded, but still. The enemy is taking much heavier casualties after the battle south of the Biscari airfield, where the fighting was particularly hot. The casualties so many that as I drove down the road, the smell of decomposing bodies followed me for 10 kilometers. On several occasions, the Germans mined the Italians' escape routes so that they were blown up as they were fleeing, which, of course, did not add to the Italians any love for their allies. We have had instances of genuine heroism. Thus, on the 10th, Italian tanks managed to break through to Jailu, where Lieutenant Colonel Darby was holding the defences with 2 battalions of Rangers. Darby himself began firing a hand machine gun at one of the tanks, but seeing that the bullets were doing no harm to the vehicle, he, under the fire of the 3 tanks, he hurried to the shore where he took a 37mm rapid-fire cannon. Since it was unloaded, the lieutenant colonel chopped up the ammunition box with an axe, loaded the gun and returned to take up a position less than 100 meters from the tank. It was coming straight at Darby. Only with the second salvo he managed to hit the machine, but the crew did not get out, and Darby, creeping closer, threw a thermite grenade, which made the Italians a roast. The next day this officer was commissioned to take charge of the regiment and was promoted to the inn rank, but declined the honour to remain with his own men whom he himself had trained. On the same day, General Wedemeyer requested that he be demoted to the rank of colonel, so that he could also command a regiment. I find both examples worthy of emulation. During the landing, an artillery lieutenant took his piper. Cubbed straight from the landing craft, using a 15-meter-long metal net as a runway. 15 meters of metal netting as a runway. All day long he flew over the city, exposed to enemy fire, and his plane was riddled with shells. Despite this, the officer continued to correct the actions of the 3rd Division, providing the necessary information to its commander. A naval officer flying a 60-meter LCT saw that the shore was too shallow for him to turn stern and make a proper landing. He then steered the vessel forward and sped ashore. Once there, the officer fired a 20mm cannon at the enemy machine guns and silenced them, allowing the soldiers to disembark in peace. The fire support of the fleet, the shelling of the fortified ashore the enemy from the sea, is to be commended. We called on the sailors for help even at night, and there was never a time when they didn't hit the target with the 3rd salvo of the ship's artillery. I never met so God-forsaken, so miserable a people as the people of this country. Once I was in a town, and the enemy attacked so suddenly that I almost to take possession of it. The shells and bombs killed several civilians, and all the others howled like coyotes and howled for probably 20 minutes. The animals here are well treated and cared for, and the cattle here are larger and more and fatter than the Arabs. Everything else is much worse than even in North Africa. The Sicilians' wagons are very peculiar. They're like a box with stanchions in the corners and on the sides, with stanchions at the corners and sides. The panels connecting the stanchions are painted with some sort of drawings. Between the bottom of the crate and the undercarriage are intricately carved frames, the kind of ornaments that were used to decorate the porches of houses in the 1880s. 1880. The ears protrude forward from the collar about 60 centimeters, and many of the horses have plumes attached to the harness at the top of the head. For the first 2 or 3 days, when fighting is going on in the suburbs of a particular town, the population, to put it mildly, are not friendly to us, but realizing that we are only beating Germans and Italians, they quickly become Americanized and, once they get used to it, use all their teeming energy to beg for cigarettes. July 23, 1943. On the afternoon of the 21st, we entrenched in position northeast of Castelvetrano, in order from there to throw into the attack the 2nd Armoured Division, which previously held closer to the centre of the island, so that the enemy would not know where it would eventually be sent. The advance to the positions began at 4 p.m., and as darkness fell, we were firmly in position, firmly in place. On the morning, our troops moved forward unstoppably. The first priority was to break through the front, which was accomplished by the 41st Infantry Regiment. Infantry regiment supported by a battalion of medium tanks of the 66th Regiment. The enemy began, and from then on the main tactic was to launch massive tank attacks in those places where the enemy still continued to offer the most stubborn resistance. At one point, a 75mm howitzer mounted on a half-tracked armoured vehicle clashed with a 105mm German gun at a distance of less than half a kilometre and destroyed the enemy. The actions of the crew and crew were as heroic as fortune had favoured them that day. We made our last halt in the mountains southwest of Palermo, which proved a tough nut to crack, but was eventually cracked by artillery and tanks. The Germans set traps for our vehicles, the likes of which I had never seen before. On the right side of the road, they dug holes 6 meters long and 3 meters deep, covered them with metal mesh, sprinkled earth and dust on top, so that the surface of this section of road was no different from the others. Then after about 10 meters later, the same trap was built on the left side of the road, so that no small game, wire fences were placed in front of the traps, expecting that the tanks would ignore such obstacles. However, we did not fall into their traps. In other places, they dug holes 6 meters wide and 5 meters deep, over a stretch of several kilometers, but we kept our eyes on the road, and therefore they didn't do us any harm. I drove through the columns of our tanks by car, meeting a very warm welcome from the personnel of the 2nd Armoured Division. Many of them seemed to know me personally. The tankers saluted at my approach and then waved at me for a long time. When we approached the city, it was already dark, so I brought with me as a guide Colonel R.F.A. Perry, the division's chief of staff. He assured me that the town was ours, so we decided to go and check it out. When we got closer, we saw that the hills on either side of the town were engulfed in flames. We followed a long road down the side of the cliff, which passed through a village whose inhabitants came to the side of the road and shouted, "Down with Mussolini, Mussolini, long live America." When we found ourselves in the city, the same thing was happening there. Those who had managed to enter Palermo before dark, like, say, General Keyes, were pelted with flowers, lemons and watermelons in such quantities that the soldiers could hardly catch them without being maimed by the hospitable Sicilians. The governor escaped, but we captured 2 generals who declared themselves happy to surrender to us because the natives are not men but beasts. The number of prisoners that day reached 10,000. On the morning of the 23rd, as I was inspecting the harbour, I passed a group of prisoners. They didn't look discouraged at all, and, rising up at the sight of me, and saluted. The harbour had not suffered much, but the destruction in the harbour area was very considerable. To a depth of 2 blocks, practically all the buildings had become piles of stones. Some of the ships, small fishing steamers, were apparently blown out of the water onto piers and docks. I just can't find any other reasonable explanation for them being there. A large number of small vessels sank, and some were snapped in half by the using the labour of the prisoners. We cleared the mud from the so-called Royal Palace, which no one cleaned, which hadn't been cleaned since the Greek occupation. The same prisoners under our orders cleared the streets of debris and filled in the holes and craters of the harbour. The Italians of Palermo look well. They are much larger than the inhabitants of the other Sicily, and, judging by the number of old people, they have a higher life expectancy. I was visited by the Cardinal's vicar, and I assured him that I admired the bravery of the Italian soldiers as well as their stupidity. As I told him, they could not have been cowards because they were Italians, and their folly because they fought bravely for a I asked him to give them this to spread the rumour of how highly the Americans appreciated the courage of the Italian army, and how sorry they were that it was on the side of the enemy. I also said that we had demonstrated our ability to destroy them, and if they didn't take the hint, they would indeed be destroyed. In fact, I cancelled the shelling from the sea and the bombardment from the air, realizing that it would cause a large number of civilian casualties, and also realizing that we could reach the objective with only 1 2nd Panzer Division. There's no to waste men, even if they are on the enemy side. I'm sure that our operation will go down in history and will be studied at Leavenworth as a model of the judicious use of military force. Also, I have no doubt it will be recognized that General Keyes' corps of General Keyes, though encountering stronger resistance and forced to follow over more inhospitable roads, was advancing faster than the Germans during their famous blitzkrieg. Be that as it may, we, wasting no time at all, seized the road leading north to secure the Second Corps advance, which was to begin in a few days. A few days later, 7th Army Headquarters, Army Post 758 U.S. as it A. Army August 1, 1943. Army Order Number 10 to be read to all personnel, soldiers and officers of the 7th Army and the Air Support VIXI Air Brigade, having landed in Sicily with the support of the Fleet and Air Force during the three weeks of continuous fighting and a titanic strain of force. Killed and captured 87,000 enemy soldiers and officers, captured or disabled 361 artillery pieces, 172 tanks, 928 trucks, and 190 airplanes, which means you are excellent soldiers. The Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Forces, General Eisenhower, and the Commander of the Army Group in Sicily are proud of you. Unanimous approval of your actions. Now, with the assistance of the British 8th Army, you will continue the offensive until victory. To victory. Your unrelenting pressure will be unstoppable. The end is clear, and it is at hand. Next stop, Messina. Lieutenant General J.S. Patton, Jr. ODA, Commander, U.S. Army. 7th Army Headquarters, Army Postal Service 758. Army August 22, 1943. Army Order Number 18, soldiers of the 7th Army. Born in the waves of the sea, baptized in blood, crowned with the crown of victory, by these 38 days of tireless labor, you have written a glorious new chapter in the history of the war, challenging the forces of Germany and Italy. You stepped confidently to success and, without once stumbled, brought the flag to the victorious summit. The swiftness and tenacity with which you have seized Palermo, the perseverance and courage you showed in storming Trowina and Messina are beyond praise. Every man in the army deserves equal honor. The unparalleled bravery of our infantry, the indomitable and furious onslaught of the tankers, the tireless labor and marksmanship of the artillerymen are the key to the great victory you have won. The engineer-sapper troops have shown the utmost ingenuity and talent, laying out roads and clearing paths to enable their comrades to move forward unhindered through the rugged terrain of this country. The logistics service has done wonders. Signalmen laid nearly 10,000 kilometers of wire, and nurses and war doctors saved the lives of many, many thousands of sick and wounded. In all situations, sailors provided us with much-needed and invaluable support. Throughout the operation, our pilots have consistently provided clear skies over our heads. Over our heads. As a result of your coordinated actions, you killed or captured 113,350 enemy soldiers and officers, disabled 265 enemy tanks, 2324 units, 23 2011-62 large guns, as well as taking as trophies hundreds of tons of military equipment. These are material evidences of your success, but your victory is also of great moral significance. For in winning it you have undermined the prestige of German arms. The President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, the Chief of Staff, Generals Eisenhower, Alexander and Montgomery congratulate you. Your glory will live forever. Commanding General, Lieutenant General, Army, J.S. Patton, Jr., October 1943. Now that a considerable time has passed since the end of the Sicily campaign, I feel privileged to offer some thoughts on it, its results and consequences. The first bell rang while we were still aboard the transports. One of the dinghies came off their keel blocks and struck my porthole. For a moment, we all thought we'd been hit by a bomb. Since we were sleeping with our clothes on, we immediately rushed out on deck. The whole coastline seemed to be on fire. The mountains, hills, and hillsides were on fire. Sometimes from this huge fire rays of searchlights burst out, which glided across the dark surface of the sea. The dark surface of the sea. Strange thing, though the light of the searchlights on deck made it possible to could easily read a newspaper. The enemy didn't seem to see us from the shore. I suppose it's a matter the refraction and the light haze created by the fire. Whenever the sailors on our destroyers saw a searchlight flash, the reaction was always the same. The same. Immediately the tracer clouds flew toward the target like bees returning to a hive. Like bees returning to a hive, and the searchlight was immediately extinguished. As it became clear later, the cause of the fire on the shore was our bombs and shells of high power. And high-powered bombs and shells had destroyed the bread fields. Fortunately for Sicilians, the crops were harvested in time, but the stubble remained, and that's what was burning. Sicilians from the south of the island are probably the dirtiest of all Sicilians. It's a matter of record there are cases of dead bodies lying in houses for days and relatives living next to the dead, because they were too lazy to carry the body out and bury it. And when we sent diggers to bury the bodies in the pits, the Sicilians were very indignant, arguing that the dead should lie horizontally, not vertically. We allowed civilians to dig graves and bury the dead properly. In the courtyard of one house where I had to stay, I counted 8 children, 11 goats, 3 dogs, several dozen chickens, and a horse, all engaged in to steal each other's scraps from the ground. And not a single one of them happened to anyone from such terrible, unsanitary conditions. No one died or, apparently, even became sick. I think that people fed on tomato sauce made in the Sicilian manner can't be poisoned by any kind of poison. The way they make the sauce is to take tomatoes, often overripe and already rotten, and crush them on old sheets, on paper, doors off their hinges, or whatever comes to hand. Then leave the bloody mass for a few days, and then pour it out on trays and put it out to dry on the sidewalk, since no one ever cleans the streets. The sauce gets all kinds of maggots and all kinds of other crap full of pathogens. Microbes, this is the seasoning with which they eat their favorite pasta. Under the wise guidance of the Germans, the Italians have become adept at building small dotties, but they got so carried away that they overdid it a bit. Camouflaged them with hay and twigs, so that our first lighters turned the pillboxes into hot fires, along with the machine guns and their calculations. In other cases, they gave themselves the trouble to erect an earthen building around the pillbox. Before the fighting started, you just had to kick the wall of the false house and the pillbox was discovered. Despite the great variety of such formidable things all over the island, they gave us very little trouble. One infantry battalion alone destroyed 39 of them in one day. Because of the lack of water, the story of the appearance of the Carthaginians in Agrigento in 470 BC is interesting because it makes it clear from when global wars were fought here. At that time, the Carthaginians were formal allies, but in reality vassals of the King of Kings, Back then, Xerxes was about to force the Dardanelles and invade Greece, to deny the Greeks reinforcements from Syracuse and the southern Italian colonies. Xerxes ordered the Carthaginians to land in Sicily and on the heel of the Italian boot, thus making the Greek colonists forget about the problems of the metropolis in the face of direct danger at home. One has to imagine the technology and communications of the time to realize how difficult it was for Xerxes' headquarters, for Xerxes' staff to get the planning right, to get the calculations right, to anticipate the course of events. I think at that time it would have taken a messenger to get from Sardis to Carthage took at least a year to get from Sardis to Carthage. Even now, with modern communications, with modern means of communication, we sometimes get into trouble. The Carthaginians had a huge army numbering almost 300,000 men, still landed in Sicily, just at Agrigento, and marched towards Syracuse. It took her, however, 5 years to reach them, and suffered a brutal defeat and died completely. At the junction of small roads in ancient Segesta, Hugh Gaffey and I had the opportunity to see a very beautiful Greek temple and theatre. I don't think I've seen anything I've ever seen in my life, leaving aside the lack of a roof. You could argue the building is in excellent condition. It's well preserved and it's had a bit of a refurbishment. A little bit of renovation not too long ago. Given that in about 470 BC, which is about 2.5 millennia ago, and a half millennia ago, the Greeks were forced out of this part of Sicily. We can to date the temple to an even earlier time. There is one interesting peculiarity connected with the architecture of the building. The columns are not monolithic and not made of 2 or 3 large blocks, as the Greeks usually did, but are instead they're made of many small stones. But the remarkable thing is that even though 25 centuries have passed, and it's now impossible to get between the stones, even a sharp knife blade. When I was 8 years old, a minister named Bliss told me that, while in the Parthenon he once put his hat on one side of the steps, then went to the other side of the steps and looked from there to the one where he'd left his hat. When he didn't see it, he became convinced of the fact that the straight lines in Greek temple architecture are actually curved and gaffy, and I made the same experiment at Segesta, placing our helmets one on top of the other, but we couldn't see them either because of the curve of the steps. The theatre, which seats at least 2,000 people, is built on a high hill, so that the audience, if they didn't like the play or the actor's performance, the beauty of the surrounding countryside, a beautiful view of the sea from up there. Apparently, the Greeks who built the theatre lived in the village behind it, but because of the inevitable barbarian cannibalism, the Greeks were not able to enjoy the beauty of the surrounding countryside due to the inevitable barbaric cannibalism of later generations, and the only evidence of their existence is the traces of human hands which are born in the shape of almost every stone on the hillside. Speaking of cannibalism of descendants, I mean, if I may so speak, architectural cannibalism as a phenomenon of history. Thus I happened to read more than once that, for example, Pisa was built with stones from the ruined Carthage. We decided to switch to champagne, which we thought there was plenty of. But then we were visited by important guests, so before we knew it, we ran out of it the second day. Where to get more? We decided to enlist the services of a professional local supplier, but since the supplier was a hardened bootlegger, he was in prison at the time in question, from which he was rescued. Through the intervention of the bishop, the supplier showed us all a model of nobility. As soon as he had accomplished the task for which he had been rescued he immediately returned to his cell himself. Agrigento was once one of the first Greek settlements in Sicily, and later became one of the first towns of the young state of Carlo, one of the first cities of the young state of Carthage. Agrigento has 3 beautiful Greek temples erected in antiquity in honor of Juno, Concordia, and Hercules. There is also a sacred road connecting all 3 temples, on both sides of which, on either side of which, are stone-carved tombstones. More correctly, they were tombstones. Now almost all of them have been scattered by the locals. The mayor of Agrigento, who also happened to be an archaeologist, volunteered to show me the temples. When we got to the most ruined one, the one dedicated to Hercules, I asked what had caused the ancient shrine to be in such a bad state, perhaps an earthquake. The mayor replied, "No, General. It is one of the bitter consequences of another war." When I asked which one, he said that the temple had been destroyed during the Second Punic War. The story of the appearance of the Carthaginians in Agrigento in 470 BC is already interesting because it makes clear when global wars were fought here. At that time, the Carthaginians were formal allies, but in reality vassals of the King of Kings, Xerxes. Back then, Xerxes was about to force the Dardanelles and invade Greece. In order to deny the Greeks from getting reinforcements from Syracuse and the southern Italian colonies, Xerxes ordered the Carthaginians to land in Sicily and on the heel of the Italian boot, thus causing the Greek colonists to forget the problems of the metropolis in the face of direct danger at home. You have to imagine the technology and communications of the time to realize how difficult it was for Xerxes' headquarters, for Xerxes' staff to get the planning right, to get the calculations right to anticipate the course of events. I think at that time it would have taken a messenger to get from Sardis to Carthage took at least a year to get from Sardis to Carthage. Even now, with modern communications, with modern means of communication, we sometimes get into trouble. The Carthaginians had a huge army, numbering almost 300,000 men, still landed in Sicily, just at Agrigento, and marched towards Syracuse. It took her, however, 5 years to reach them, and suffered a brutal defeat and died completely. At the junction of small roads in ancient Segesta, Hugh Gaffey and I had the opportunity to see a very beautiful Greek temple and theatre. I don't think I've seen anything I've ever seen in my life. Leaving aside the lack of a roof, you could argue the building is in excellent condition. It's well preserved and it's had a bit of a refurbishment. A little bit of renovation not too long ago. Given that in about 470 BC, which is about 2.5 millennia ago, and a half millennia ago, the Greeks were forced out of this part of Sicily. We can to date the temple to an even earlier time. There is one interesting peculiarity connected with the architecture of the building. The columns are not monolithic and not made of 2 or 3 large blocks, as the Greeks usually did, but are instead they're made of many small stones. But the remarkable thing is that even though 25 centuries have passed, and it's now impossible to get between the stones, even a sharp knife blade. When I was 8 years old, a minister named Bliss told me that, while in the Parthenon, he once put his hat on one side of the steps, then went to the other side of the steps, and looked from there to the one where he'd left his hat. When he didn't see it, he became convinced of the fact that the straight lines in Greek temple architecture are actually curved. Me and Gaffey and I made the same experiment at Segesta, placing our helmets one on top of the other, but we couldn't see them either because of the curve of the steps. The theatre, which seats at least 2,000 people, is built on a high hill, so that the audience, if they didn't like the play or the actor's performance, the beauty of the surrounding countryside, a beautiful view of the sea from up there. Apparently, the Greeks who built the theatre lived in the village behind it, but because of the inevitable barbarian cannibalism, the Greeks were not able to enjoy the beauty of the surrounding countryside, due to the inevitable barbaric cannibalism of later generations. And the only evidence of their existence is the traces of human hands, which are born in the shape of almost every stone on the hillside. Speaking of cannibalism of descendants, I mean, if I may so speak, architectural cannibalism as a phenomenon of history. Thus, I happen to read more than once that, for example, Pisa was built of stones brought from the destroyed Carthage. The city, and especially the harbour of Syracuse, is of particular interest to me, because there is hardly a port on earth that has seen as many naval landing operations as Syracuse has experienced. Looking out over the water in the harbour, I sometimes thought I saw Greek triremes, Roman galleys, Vandals, Arabs, Crusaders, the French, the English, and our American ships, which, each in its turn, stormed or attempted to storm the port and the city. I have not yet named them all. When we first came to Sicily, and then to Sardinia and Corsica, we were struck by the sheer number of little towers that littered the coastline. They were probably built between the 15th and 17th centuries, when the life of the islands was greatly influenced by Genoa. A man would pick a place he thought was suitable for a tower and build it, then went to those who represented the authorities in the area and offered to take on guard duty at that particular site. Usually the garrison would consist of members of the tower owner's family, who was paid for his work, which was very paltry in our terms, $50 a year, $50 a year in today's money. But at that time such a fee did not seem so modest as to be neglected. In short, here's a version of the origin of these towers, the construction of which many attribute to the activities of Arab pirates. Here is another peculiarity that is characteristic of Sicily. Small towns here are built on top of sheer cliffs. It's as if the builders were magnetically drawn there. If you look into the matter, you'll find that the largest structure built on top of the mountain is a Norman castle. The Normans invaded Sicily between 900 and 970, and, as you can imagine, every Norman leader felt entitled to build himself a tower, a so-called donjon. Called a donjon, on top of the steepest cliff he could find. Then, as the wealth of the lord increased, the donjon, though of course not always, was enriched with an inner and outer courtyard, with an inner and outer courtyard with corresponding fortifications. Over time, the descendants of the soldiers of that first lord builder and the peasants who lived in the neighbourhood turned the chateau into a town to shelter in times of trouble. The Palais Royal in Palermo is of just such origin. The site on which it's built is a solidified outburst of volcanic lava. The Arabs built a castle on it which they called Exar. The volcanic hill, reduced in size and ennobled, still exists today, and the Caesar, built by the Arabs around 700 AD, is still the centerpiece of the palace. Of the palace, unfortunately, the palace itself has also undergone a beautiful process, and so the ancient masonry is only preserved at the base. In the basement of the ancient tower we found the Norman treasury, which consisted of 2 rooms passing one into the other, the floor of which was formed by the rock on which the structure was actually built. To get to the inner room, you have to through 2 doors and past a small front room. The doors are so designed so that when the outer one, which gave access to the corridor, was opened, the inner one automatically closes. When the inner one opens, the outer one closes by itself. In that smaller room is a 3-meter deep pit, the bottom of which is a stone monolith. It was used to store treasures, bowls, vases, trays, and the like. Utensils. In all 4 corners of the room hangs one huge ceiling-mounted jug. A sort of amphora for wine. Because of the hanging amphora, a sentry entering the room could easily make sure that no one had damaged the bottoms of them in order to get at the money hidden there, for it is for the storage of coins, not at all, and not the wine that these amphorae are for. When we storm towns like this, or just passed through them, I had pictures in my mind's eye. In my mind's eye, a bunch of knights and soldiers in armour sitting in these forts, ruling the world. In forts like this, ruling the world as they knew it, how few in number they were, and how poorly armed they were compared to us, with our modern guns, tanks, airplanes, which rolled, rushed, flew past the cities in endless streams, though for all our might, the ancient knights and their equally foul-smelling brothers in arms would find an outlet here and laugh heartily at our improvised cavalry with mules for horses. But what could be done? To travel over impassable terrain, and there are no roads. In this country, where we had to fight and not tour, we had to create improvised regiments of horsemen who happened to be saddled, not only mules and donkeys, but sometimes even oxen. But saddling is a strong word. It's good if you can get a locally made saddle, captured from the Italians, or there was nothing left to do but make do with a cot. Once I met a young soldier who was a happy owner of an Italian saddle. He had the saddle almost on the horse's withers. When I stopped him and wanted to ask him who advised him to saddle his horse in this way, the animal lowered its neck, and the fellow went tumbling and the guy went down. When he got up, he confessed to me that he thought that was the way to saddle a horse. To saddle horses. I guess in all his life so far. The only time he'd ever had to deal with animals, the only time he'd ever been allowed to ride on an elephant's head at the circus. That said, our improvised cavalry did help us win that campaign. I don't know if we could have won if we hadn't at least had such units. How we regretted that we didn't have a full cavalry division on hand with light field artillery. If we had even a few real American regiments of mounted no German would have left the island. The way of life of the local people is quite entertaining. They never seem to have had the time to choose a proper place to cook, so their kitchen is the street. However, since our arrival, the equipment used by the cooks has improved considerably, because they're now using our used 22-litre oil cans. However, they not only cook outside, but they also sing there, and what's absolutely killing them is that they sing around the clock. Because they live on garlic. Each of them has at least one garland of garlic on their shoulder, Their singing is not only sweet to the ear, but also the sense of smell. Unlike the Arabs, the Sicilians treat animals well, never hitting them. They don't use hard bridles that tear the mouths of stubborn horses. With an ordinary bridle, and in spite of this, livestock raised by their owners with love and in good conditions, the most docile livestock I've ever seen. This characteristic is fully applicable to mules as well. In order to make the animal move under saddle or in a harness, the Sicilian makes a peculiar sound, something between a burp and a heavy sigh. In order to stop, the horse doesn't need a special command. As soon as the owner stops grunting, the animal stops by itself. Once there was an amusing incident connected with Moroccans. A Sicilian came to me, with a complaint about the behavior of Moroccan soldiers, or hums, as they are more commonly called. He said he could understand a lot of things, because it was known that all the Gumas were incorrigible thieves, vile murderers and rapists, and no one expects anything good from them. Well, let them have it. It's a war, they're bound to kill or rape someone. They rape, that's what it's all about. But the fact that the Hums broke into his house, slaughtered his rabbits, and skinned them in the hay, that, from his point of view, didn't fit into his point of view. There is a limit to everything. Since Sicilians spend most of their time sitting down, it would be logical to assume that, over many centuries of sitting, their thought would unusually in at least one direction. They'd become consummate. Designers all sorts of chairs and armchairs. But not so. The Sicilians are capable to sit on anything, on rocks, on boxes, on the ground, even in the mud, but not on chairs or armchairs. Meanwhile, they are very cheerful and cheerful people, and the mud in which they live does not weigh them down in the least. From my point of view, it would be great to try to bring them up to our standards, to make them live up to our standards. They will never be able to accept them and will never be happy in our world. What can be said about Corsica? Imagine that God took the most impassable, the bleakest stretch of the Rocky Mountains, and threw it into the sea. Corsica is a lot of many cliffs of polished granite devoid of any vegetation. However, of Corsica still has at least a few nice things to say about it. First of all, it's entirely French, and secondly, completely unscathed by air. When you enter a town like Ajaccio, there's something you miss, probably the destroyed houses, the streets littered with rubble, and the mangled machinery. Ajaccio is completely whole, as if there were no war around. Naples, on the contrary, was subjected to heavy bombardment, but our pilots even here again demonstrated their skill, so that we got the port in practically working order. Pompeii is an exemplary ruin and a perfect cross-section of ancient history, a piece of ancient life as it was, preserved for us by an angry volcano. It is truly a pity that during the hostilities we had to bombard this city monument, and a great fortune too. And it is a great blessing that the raids did not cause serious damage. As my visit to Cairo had already been reported in the press and, indeed, even broadcast on the radio. On the radio, I feel authorized to write about it. At 7:15 on December 12, technicians at the Palermo airfield poured fuel into the tanks of the airplane on board of which Colonel Codmanomi and I, 8 officers of the 7th Army headquarters, decided to go to Egypt. We made our first landing at Benghazi, where we had time to have a bite to eat while the car was refueled. The airfield was located about 80 kilometers from the city, and everywhere on it there were still small pieces of shells and bombs all over the place. Except for this circumstance, it is safe to say that the airfield was in excellent condition. The ground here is practically devoid of any vegetation, almost nothing at all that would be suitable for use as a landmark. Besides, it is extremely hilly. I should say that there are not very few places on the ground where a military unit can be out of sight only 1.5 kilometers away from the observer. Under such conditions, to track enemy movements could be very effective. The use of balloons. Even the command towers used by artillerymen in the old days. Would be useful. The soil is brown as if it's been taken out of an oven. And anyone who has been to Indio can easily imagine what the soil looks like, just to think of the sands lying all over the place. But when several cars take the same path one after another, on the same road one after another, the soil cracks. In view of this, we were warned that in desert conditions, it was highly desirable that the vehicles not to follow each other. However, in Indio, we found it made more sense to follow the same track in columns. Of course, I find it seems to me to be less difficult than in our American desert, especially when it comes to tanks. From Benghazi, we flew straight across the desert to Tobruk, a small, neglected town with an artificial harbour where we saw full to bursting with wrecked ships and mere shipwrecks. From Tobruk, we continued on towards Al Alamein, keeping to the railroad. Even though we were flying very low, we still saw only a small amount of wrecked vehicles and guns. There were hardly any lines of communication at all. From Al Alamein, we headed along the coast to Alexandria and then turned south up the Nile to Cairo. What a stark difference between the desert and the verdant Nile Delta. The main life of Egypt, I was told, takes place in the Delta, which is 255 miles wide, which reaches a width of 250 kilometers, while the rest of the country is an endless strip of almost uninhabited land stretching from north to south. 50 kilometers wide and 450 kilometers wide and more than 4,000 kilometers long. When on the flight to Cairo, we saw the pyramids. I was overcome with a kind of trembling realization of the greatness of ancient civilizations. The grandeur of the ancient civilizations that flourished in these parts many thousands of years ago. At the airfield, we were met by General Sir Henry Maitland Wilson's adjutant, Major X. Chapman Walker. The adjutant took Codman and me to the general's house, where we were quartered there during the continuance of our visit. The general himself was not there when we arrived, but his former chief of staff and several British officers. Despite the unpretentiousness and modesty, I found General Maitland Wilson's quarters quite comfortable. The house was located about 30 kilometers south of the city at a place called Abu Mahdi. Major Chapman Walker had prepared a whole program for us, which we approved. December 13, 1943. In the morning, Codeman and Major Chapman Walker and I, in the company of Madame Renfoli, went on a tour of Cairo's shops. Cairo is a nasty place. It reminds me of New York City in 1928, like they were in New York then. On both sides of the street there are cars, and even in the middle of the highway, parked cars. There's a lot of stuff in the windows. You can get anything you want. But the prices are sky high and many people are selling to the highest bidder. The prices are best illustrated the silk stockings, which I examined, cost £4. The Egyptian peasants, who abound in the town, are much smaller than the Sicilians, and much uglier, though when I looked at the Sicilians I thought they were as ugly as ever. When they built the Assuana Dam, the water was full of nematode worms, parasitic nematodes. They become a menace. Many peasants suffer from stomach pains and decreased potency. To combat the pain and restore potency by smoking hashish for a while. But the end result is more often than not the opposite of what smokers are trying to achieve. Complete impotence and reduced immunity to diseases caused by parasite bites. Thus, a vicious circle is created. Before the war, the authorities prevented the entry of hashish into the country, which made the population unhappy. Now that the government is no longer concerned to fight the hashish traffickers, the people get as much hashish as they want, and seem to be quite happy with that. The Egyptians are indescribably filthy. Not only outwardly, they're filthy in general. I have seen with my own eyes a man defecating in a canal of clear water and 10 meters downstream, a woman doing laundry, and a little further down the villagers were fetching water for their own needs. Of the whole population of Egypt, 1,000 to 1,200 persons may be distinguished who own practically the whole of the land, not counting the 800,000 acres approximately equally divided among 1 million peasants. The rest of the people have none of this, nothing at all. Nothing at all. The average wage of a labourer is $50 a year, and of this amount part must be paid for drinking. Of that amount, a part of it has to be paid for drinking water. The vessels used by the Egyptians are not much different from those that travelled the Nile on the Nile in the days of the pharaohs. It is true that since 762 A, local shipwrights have adopted the triangular Latin sail, brought here by the Arabs and replacing the old quadrangular sail, to replace the old four-cornered sail. Despite their unpresentable appearance, the Egyptians' ships they are very manoeuvrable and have a fair speed. I hear the English have constructed special sailing boats, thinking they can replace for the local boats, but it didn't work out. The new ships were not uncompetitive. As far as I could tell, the local vessels had no keel, but they had a huge rudder, which also serves as a centreboard. After shopping, we treated ourselves to cocktails at the famous Shepherd Hotel. I can't say anything bad about the cocktails. Good cocktails. But the price is an impressive $1.50 a drink. In the afternoon we visited the tanker training school. It was interesting, although our similar facilities in Knox and Benning would be of a higher class. December 14, 1943. At 700 we boarded an airplane and took off in the direction of Jerusalem, flying over the Suez Canal, over the places where Moses wandered with his people. This is where the children of Israel crossed the canal, I thought. At the same time, for some reason it did not occur to me that in biblical times there had been no canal here, just as there had been virtually no fresh water all the way across the desert from Bitter Lake to the Mediterranean Sea. Anyway, they managed to get through the desert, and Napoleon took pretty much the same route, though he lost all his luggage in the changing the wind. From the Suez Canal, we flew along the route of Allenby's cavalry, crossed the Wadi al-Arish at the very point where the British defeated the Turks in battle. The obstacle did not appear to me as insurmountable as I had imagined it from books, nor did Beersheba and the surrounding territory seem too difficult in the sense for modern warfare, but away from the wells, the terrain becomes a veritable sea of sand. It's rather difficult to understand how Allenby and his cavalry managed to get through it at all. From Beersheba we flew to Hebron and Bethlehem, and then turned to the westward and passed south of Jerusalem to eventually land at Ekron, close to the coast, where we were met by automobiles in which we travelled the 50 kilometers that separated Ekron from Jerusalem. The only reason for agreeing with the one who called Palestine the land of milk and honey was to compare it with the land of Jerusalem. Of milk and honey was the comparison of Palestine with the surrounding deserts. The entire land of milk and honey is covered with bare rocky hills, around the slopes of which the sparse olive trees are languishing on the slopes of which the sparse olive trees live a miserable existence. As for the honey itself, we never saw a single beehive. Although we did see mimosas quite often, in our arrival in Jerusalem, we were met by Major General D.F.M. McConnell, who was in charge of the region. As a guide for a tour, as a guide to the sights of Jerusalem, the general gave us a British clergyman who had lived in the city for a long time. We entered the city through the gate that was stormed by the Knights of Tancred in 1099. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built in such a way that it is the only one of its kind in the world. Of the Holy Sepulchre is so constructed that both the place where the cross on which Christ was executed stood and the cave where he was buried are located inside the building. The church is owned jointly by Catholics, Greeks and Copts, and by a strange quirk of fate, or perhaps in accordance with by a strange quirk of fate, or perhaps by far-sighted British policy, the usher is Muslim. I found it absurd that throughout my visit to Jerusalem, I was followed by 4 British Secret Service agents of the British Secret Service. The wildest thing is that when I entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they followed me. They followed me. You have to have no faith in anything to fear assassins in a place like this. In such a place, from the Holy Sepulchre, we went to the Crusader Chapel, the place where the young men who lived there were knighted. Young men who lived in Jerusalem were knighted. The chapel houses a sword that is believed to have been used in such rituals. In my opinion, it is a fake. For one, first of all, the hilt is the wrong shape, and secondly, the sword is too light, although the blade is correct. From there we went to the place where the cross stood in those times immemorial. A large part of the mountain had been cut down by the Romans during their occupation of Palestine, and they had filled in a cave, where Jesus was buried, and built a temple of Venus on the site. However, be that as it may, the altar was apparently erected in the very spot where once stood the cross. In that chapel I purchased a rosary for Mary Scalia and asked her to consecrate it on the altar. Leaving the church, we walked up the Way of Sorrow, a narrow, muddy street, to the place where the Roman Forum used to be. The whole way is no more than 800 meters long. But the priests make ritual stops along the way, depending on which denomination the priest belongs to, since the Orthodox have more stops than the Catholics. It takes a Greek priest an entire day. A Greek priest takes a whole day to travel. From the Forum we were taken by car to the Garden of Gethsemane, where, as it is believed, the olive trees that witnessed the Gethsemane Mass are still intact. The olive trees that witnessed Christ's arrest. After lunch with the commander, we went to the airfield and flew back to Cairo over the road near Gaza. However much I looked at the ground beneath us, nowhere did I found no material evidence of warfare but the cactus thickets into which the tanks had crashed. I recognized. We arrived in Cairo in the dark, thus not only in a day's time making the journey that took the children of Israel 40 years to make, but actually twice. On the 15th we had arranged with a local literate to show us the sights. We naturally had the pyramids in mind, but when we dropped off our genius at the Shepherd Hotel and told him where we wanted to go, he was terribly surprised and said that the pyramids were worthless and the only sights of Cairo that we simply had to see were the mosque. He also remarked that he'd been in Cairo for 40 years and had only been near the pyramids once. To which I told him that I had already seen all the mosques in the world that I should see, and that we could do without his services. We went to the pyramids, taking a very talkative, but not at all suitable for the role of tour guide. I was disappointed with the pyramids. They weren't as big as or as imposing as I'd expected them to be. The Egyptian ones compared to the ones I'd seen in Mexico. The Sphinx didn't live up to expectations either, not that big at all, and most importantly, in urgent need of restoration. However, the temple at the feet of the Sphinx impressed me. Apparently, the builders first stacked the huge stones in one place and then began to cut out the coffin in them, and then carve tombs into them. The roof of one of the tombs was made of a single, perfectly polished slab of stone. Slab 6 meters long, 3.5 meters wide, 2 meters thick, and perfectly to fit the grooves in the walls on which it lay. Both the polishing and shaping of the stones was done with bronze tools. The Egyptians possessed the now lost of bronze tempering techniques lost to modern times. At 17:30 I had a talk with the officers of the Middle East Group's ground force headquarters on the subject of landing operations, 500 people in all. I think they benefited from our conversation. They listened to me very attentively and even applauded, which was against British tradition. Several of the officers sent. One of them assured me that in all his military career he had never learned as much useful knowledge as my half-hour lecture. December 16, 1943. General Beaumont Nesbitt, who was in charge of the reception of distinguished guests, drove me to the Hotel Shepherd Hotel, where we were joined by staff officers. After that, we drove for 2.5 hours, drive along a freshwater canal to the Joint Operations Training Center, located on the shores of the diminutive Bitterroot Lake. It seems the British enjoyed our talk yesterday so much that they wanted me to have another meeting, this time with the two of us. Another meeting, this time with the 200 officers who were training at the centre, run by Lieutenant General M. Scobie. The training centre, inferior in both size and equipment to the one we had built in Mostaganem, had at least one advantage over it as far as practical training methods were concerned. Practical training methods. There were stands built right in the water in the shape of the sides of real ships. So that the landing boats could get up close to them. And the trainees could practice by transferring to the ships in an environment as close as possible to the one in which they had been as close as possible to what they would have to do in a real combat situation. On the way back, we were caught in the usual sandstorm, during which you could see almost nothing at arm's length. On returning, we learned of the arrival of General Sir Henry Maitland Wilson. He was present at dinner. A large and rather gregarious man, the general made of than any other of the highest officers in the British Army. All of them, including the generals, were anxious to know my opinion of General Montgomery. But I answered with the utmost restraint, and did not yield to attempts to call me to, and did not yield to any attempt at candor. On the 17th, General Nesbitt took me to meet General Anders, commanding the 2nd Polish Corps. Accompanied by Anders and the officers of we went to the camp on the eastern side of the Nile Delta, Accompanying us also was a guard of honour consisting of very well trained soldiers. Then we had lunch. General Anders pinned to my tunic the insignia of a Polish lieutenant general, and the insignia of the 2nd Polish Corps. I gave him one of my general's insignia, as well as the U.S. 7th Army stripes. Anders made a very good impression on me. During World War I, he had served as Chief of Staff of a Russian division. He was wounded 7 times and was twice awarded Polish medals for bravery. I've never seen better training than the soldiers of his corps. I have never seen in either our or the British Army. He confided to me with a smile that, if he and his men had been caught between the Germans and the Russians, they would have risked of being torn in two, not knowing which was better to fight, the one or the other. After the review of the 2nd Polish Corps, Colonel Cummings and I, at the invitation of the Commander of the Armed Forces in the Middle East, Vice Admiral Sir Arthur Willis. Willis went by car to Alexandria. We drove through the whole of the Delta, but unfortunately, most of the way was in the dark, so we could see very little. December 18, 1943, at 10 o'clock, Colonel Moseley, who had been 4 times in the Grand National, picked us up and took us to the Yacht Club, where we met the Admiral and were given a long boat for a tour of the harbour. We then visited a British repair shop of astonishing size and poor organisation British tank repair shop. We found nothing of interest there and drove back across the desert to Cairo, which was about 250 kilometres from us. December 19, 1943. At 700 we left Cairo in a southerly direction to Khan. General Wilson had sent Major Emery, the famous Egyptologist, number 2 man in the Carter's expedition that unearthed Tutankhamun's tomb. Karnak is located on the east bank. Here we transferred from the airplane to a breathless, incandescent Fords and went to the river, across which we crossed in a local boat. There were 3 more of the same old Fords waiting for us. We immediately drove them to the Valley of the Kings. They gave us the best guide we could think of, Major Emery. Major Emery himself was an excavator. The first thing we did was to visit Tutankhamun's tomb, which, according to Emery, is very small. Originally, there were 3 sarcophagi in the stone tomb. At present, only 1 sarcophagus survives, the second to last. It contains the remains of Tutankhamun, the first sarcophagus, made of pure gold, valued at £7,000. Pounds is in a museum in Cairo. The one in which the king rests is made of wood, but is covered with gold plates. A third, all of wood, is also kept in the Cairo Museum in Cairo. As Major Emery assured us, the tomb of the king was built in the image and likeness of his earthly dwelling, so the furnishings and utensils in the tomb are as similar as possible to those in Tutankhamun's palace. Emery noted that compared to the posthumous dwellings of other kings, such as Ramses, Tutankhamun's tomb seems like a cozy little house. From the Valley of the Kings we went to Thebes and visited the tomb of the first minister of the pharaoh, who ruled immediately after Ramses. Tutankhamun. This tomb was of the greatest of interest to us, and here's why. 1. It was discovered by Major Emery himself, and 2. It is one of the few sites in ancient Egypt that don't have traditional bas-reliefs. Reliefs. Well, they're only traditional on one side of the entrance to the tomb. Whereas on the opposite side, they're modified. The reason for this is because of the following. While the Prime Minister was in power, there was some sort of church reform. It's a kind of ecclesiastical reform. But because the tomb took a long time to build, one half of the drawings reflected the old traditions, and the other half was done in accordance with the latest developments, the latest innovations. What's also very interesting is that if you look carefully, you can distinguish in the tomb the individual stages of the ancient craftsman's work. On one wall of the tomb, which was never finished, you can see the lines drawn by the artists. A rough drawing, and further away there is a similar drawing, already finalized. That has been fired. Then we went to the temple and tomb of Ramses et. Here is an interesting thing. During the war in Syria, Ramses saw the crenellated fortifications on the walls and ordered that they be made the same on the walls of his palace. We crossed the river, had lunch and visited the temple at Luxor and another temple at Karnak. The distance between these two structures is no more than a kilometre. I'm sure anyone who likes to wander among the ruins should visit any of the others first, before visiting the Egyptian ones, because after the Egyptian ruins, the others he may find the others uninteresting. In the courtyard of Karnak are the ruins of an ancient Roman forum, which, on their own, are quite impressive, but the monuments of ancient Egypt outshine everything, so against your will your eyes turn to them. At one point in Karnak, there's a sloping embankment where the builders used to drag up the sloping mound of stone to build their unique creations. There were several obelisks in the temple. Major Emery drew our attention to an interesting circumstance. When obelisks were erected in New York or London, Paris or Madrid, our modern builders, with their advanced machinery, had to tweak the bases, invent special fasteners, because the statues wouldn't go straight up on the pedestal, perpendicular to the pedestal. While the monuments at Karnak, which weighed 75 tons each, stood upright and in the right position at once and without any fasteners. When our plane landed on the airfield in Cairo, it was already dark. The next day, the 20th, we flew to Palermo. Since Field Marshal Lord Gort had invited me to visit Malta immediately after Algeria, on January 4, 1944, Colonel Cudman, Captain Stiller, and I boarded an airplane and flew to the island. Since we were not expected to visit before 3 o'clock, we had still time to fly over the places where our Second Corps fought last spring. When we were about 100 kilometers northwest of Constantine, our pilot Hetzer reported that he had once seen the ruins of an ancient Roman city in these parts. So we went looking for these ruins and we found them. Surprisingly, we found a large and well-preserved ancient city with a large temple and a fine theatre. However, no matter how many maps I looked at, it was not marked on any of them. As we approached Tebessa, we were right above the place where I took over command of the Second Corps. In front of my eyes, I could see fields with tanks roaring their engines where tanks roared their engines, guns were placed and tents for rest. Soldiers. None of that was there now. Not much time had passed, and there was no trace of the huge army that had fought on this land was gone. What happened to the piles of broken equipment that we and the Germans had scraped up here when Rommel attacked the Germans, when Rommel attacked Tebessa by rushing through the Kasserine Pass? Everything was cleaned up, and so clean that it looked as if no fierce battles had ever taken place here. Any fierce battles had never taken place. Who can remember now what was going on at Feriana, where we had or at Garfsur? When you look over the ground where we met the enemy in mortal combat, you realize the greatness of the American soldier. It is extremely difficult to conduct military operations in these mountains is extremely difficult. It's fortunate that I didn't realize at the time how difficult the terrain we had to fight in. I didn't have an airplane to go up in the air and see it for myself, so you had to make decisions based on what we could see on the map. If I'd known how difficult the terrain was, I probably would have been more cautious. One very important thing to keep in mind, though, if you find it difficult to fight in a particular terrain, where is the basis for assuming it's easy for the enemy? On the other hand, the eucalyptus road which cut across our positions and over which, on the map I had the map of which I spent many anxious hours in heavy thought, was in reality not so dangerous. However, if I had had a chance to go up and see it from the air, I might have slept better. From Algeciras we flew to Macnassa, where none of the tanks were left, that we lost in the battle. Malta, which we arrived at 3 o'clock, turned out to be almost entirely different from what I had imagined. It's littered with little villages and the spaces between them with equally small fields. Very small. The only place where really spacious is the airfield. The island has a great deal of porous, easy to work and pliable, almost like wood, but hardens when exposed to the air. As the world now knows, to save vital equipment from German air raids, the Maltese hid vital equipment in caves. Meanwhile, I doubt if the whole world realizes how huge these caves are, and most importantly, how easy they are to build. And, of course, how quickly the British were able to cope. The aftermath of the German blitzkrieg was commendable. All the Air Force equipment, including the cave shelters, was shown to us by my buddy Air Marshal Park, who was in command the Royal Air Force in Malta during the fighting here, and he did a good job. The British Air Force units in Malta are the most disciplined. The most disciplined, most fit soldiers and officers that ever served in the Air Force. And I'm not talking not only the British Air Force, but also the United States Air Force. The next day, Lord Gort's adjutant, Captain Holland, gave us a tour of the island's sites. We visited forts, harbours, several churches and other places. The forts in Malta are not like I've seen in other lands. The architecture is pre-Vobanovsky, but they were clearly built in the age of siege artillery. I mean, the walls are 2.5 to 5 meters thick, and the loopholes on the walls and towers are designed for guns rather than light small arms. During the siege of 1528, 3 fortresses, one on the island itself, and the other 2 on its offshoots, which held only 400 knights and 108 mercenary soldiers, were able to withstand the attacks of 40,000 of Turkish troops. The natural features of the island were utilized in the construction of the fortresses. To build a fortification, the craftsmen didn't have to build a foundation. They just carve it into the rock and then build on that natural base, to build the walls to the right height. Many interesting things I saw in the library of the Order of Malta, in the excursion through which we were accompanied by a librarian who could write and read in 9 languages, and was translating ancient manuscripts. One manuscript, dated 1420, told the story of the life of Saint Anthony, who was haunted by a demon in the guise of a beautiful woman. I found it particularly interesting because the drawings in it showed how knights' armour had evolved of knightly armour over the course of 300 years, from the beginning of the 12th century to the beginning of the 15th century. An armourer's shop, and armour hung in it like coats and suits in a pawn shop. And here's the interesting thing. Most historians tend to divide the history of medieval protective armour by centuries. At one time, chain mail replaced plate armour. Then wrought iron armour replaced chain mail. And here we've seen a clear example of the fact that at least in the 1400s, chain mail armour was peacefully with wrought armour. Both had their uses. The other folio was one of the first copies of the Bible to be printed using wooden scripts, using wooden type. All the capital letters were omitted, and then the scribe wrote them in by hand. To become a Knight of Malta, you had to have 16 generations of noble ancestry, generations of noble ancestors. So anyone who was going to join the order had to present his family tree, which was studied by a special commission on heraldry, and only after careful checking for errors or falsifications was the candidate accepted. Or falsification. The candidate was admitted to the cloister. Many of these trees sometimes went back into the 12th century. In addition to a clean pedigree, a knight had to serve as a common soldier on a galleys for a year and a half and then some time in a hospital. A knight also took 4 vows: vows of poverty, chastity, humility, and obedience. The vow of poverty required him to give 4/5 of his property to the order's treasury. However, if a knight made a career in the order, he was rewarded 100-fold. So many brothers ended their lives in wealth and luxury. This is especially true the last centuries of the order in Malta, because then the Hospitallers took over the pirate business in the Mediterranean under the pretext of the war against the Turks, which had been fought at sea since their settlement in Rhodes. The Maltese brothers were no longer just after Muslim ships, but all the ships they could catch up with. Providing conditions for the fulfillment of the vow of chastity was the idefix of one great magistrate who, anxious to protect his brothers from temptation, moved all the maidens and ladies to the opposite side of the harbour to get a date with his beloved. The knight had to cross the water and reveal himself. Naturally, such a brother deserved censure from those who stayed on the right shore. But he certainly found sympathy from those he met on the other. The vow of humility was much simpler. It was enough to wash the feet of 3 beggars on Maundy Thursday. A knight was required to fulfill his vow of obedience, to fulfill his oath of obedience. Let me make a final note of the following. We must not forget that the average Maltese man has never seen mountains, rivers, lakes, forests, or railroads. Moreover, as I've been told, my friends, men of knowledge, he has not the slightest desire to see any of these things.